Hi! Today we're going to be making French press coffee, or in Australia more commonly referred to as plunger coffee. Things you're going to need: a French press, some coffee, some scales, a timer, some cups, and some hot water. First thing you want to do is to make sure that your French press has been preheated with some boiling water. This ensures that when you first pour the water you're going to brew within, that the temperature isn't decreased by the cold glass. I've already done this in this instance. Next, you're going to want to add your freshly ground coffee. Now when I say freshly ground, I don't mean 2 weeks ago at your local cafe, I mean you've just ground the coffee now. You need to have coffee ground as close to when you're going to brew it, or else you lose a lot of the flavors that are there, and ideally you want to have a grinder at home. I've just ground this coffee, and I've ground it conveniently enough for the French press setting. On most grinders this is choosable. Otherwise, you want it really coarse, coarser than most other brewing methods. After grinding your coffee right before using it, you then add it to the preheated French press. Obviously at home you don't have to be precise with exactly the temperature that the water is. So what I generally like to do at home is boil the kettle and then wait about a minute after it's come off the boil, and that should be around the right temperature. You don't want water that's exactly boiling because that's going to scald the coffee and over extract it, creating quite a bitter cup. I'm going to settle the bed of coffee so something nice and even to pour my water over. And I'm going to make sure I tare my scales so that they're on 0. This way I can accurately measure precisely how much water I'm pouring into the brewing chamber. You want to make sure that you keep your brewing ratio, that is the amount of coffee to water that you're using, accurate. In this instance, I'm using 500 ml of water to 30 grams of coffee. I'm using a tried and tested brewing ratio there of 60 grams of coffee to a litre of water. You can adjust this to personal taste, maybe in 5 grams per litre increments, either higher or lower, but most people enjoy French press at this brewing ratio. So after adding my 30 grams of coffee and tearing my scales, I'm now going to add my 97 to 96 degree water over the top of the coffee. Now, as I pour my water, I'm going to do so carefully and consistently, both measuring how much water I'm pouring in and starting my timer. Obviously, like measuring the weight, you want to make sure that you're timing things accurately so that you can repeat them the same every time. As I pour my water, I'm going to try and fully saturate all the coffee by pouring in a circular motion, but I'm going to do so carefully as well so that, again, I can repeat the process the same the next time I make a coffee. I'm going to start my timer as I pour. Fully saturating all of the coffee, pouring from a height but still carefully, till I hit 500 grams. Then I'm going to place the lid of my French press on top of the coffee and push the filter down just below the surface of the water. What this does is ensure that all the grounds of coffee are fully saturated in the water. Otherwise, as the coffee has water poured onto it, it releases carbon dioxide gas. This gas will form a layer at the top and mean that the coffee grounds sitting on top aren't going to be in contact with the water, and thus they aren't going to be extracting, and you're going to end up with an unevenly extracted brew. I'm going to leave this to brew for 10 minutes. Now, most times people will do a French press for 4 to 6 minutes. I've found through trial and error that 10 minutes actually gets you a better cup. Now, you might find that the coffee's a little bit colder when you do this, but when I say cold, I mean you can drink it straight away and it's still nice and hot, as opposed to it burns your mouth. Now, as you can see, the CO2, the carbon dioxide that's being released from the coffee, is forming a gas layer on top of the coffee grounds. This is again making sure that even though I've got the screen depressed, some of the coffee isn't in contact with the water and thus isn't extracting. Now, I'd like to deal with this with some agitation. Agitation could be stirring or in any way causing turbulence in the coffee. What it does is mean that all the coffee grounds extract evenly and you get a much nicer cup in the end. To do this, instead of stirring, which is very hard to repeat, what I like to do is slowly and carefully raise the screen of the filter just enough to release that buildup of gas. You'll find that as I do this, the coffee grounds will sink, some of them at least, and then I repress the screen down to again have some of the water just sitting above the screen. I like to do this every 2 to 3 minutes in the brew because you'll find that doing it once isn't enough. It might be towards the end of the brew that you don't need to do it anymore. That's a judgment call. But what you want to make sure is that all the coffee is completely saturated. Eventually, you want all the coffee to be sitting on the bottom of the chamber where it's all completely in contact with water. While we're waiting for our coffee to brew, I'm going to quickly go through a few things. Regarding your grind, it's very hard, and I know, especially in a video like this, to work out exactly what grind you should use. I'm afraid that's just going to be up to trial and error. If you find that the coffee is a little bit over-extracted, that is a little bit too bitter, or a little bit under-extracted, that is a little bit sour and weak, then you have to adjust the grind accordingly. If it's over-extracted, then what you want to do is coarsen up the grind a little bit, have slightly larger coffee particles. If it's under-extracted, then you want to do the reverse and have coffee that's a little bit finer. Now, when we're talking about any style of brewing coffee, obviously there is more than one factor in determining how quickly or how well the coffee is extracted. Grind is just one of those. That's why I keep talking about being consistent with all the other measurements. If you make sure that you keep the brewing ratio, the time, and the temperature and the agitation of the coffee all the same, it means that if you adjust the grind size, all your other variables are consistent, and it means that you only have one variable that you have to change in order to get the perfect cup of coffee you can out of that. So it can be a little frustrating when the first one you make isn't great, but it means that next time you just know, okay, I'll grind a little bit finer, and then when I make it again, it's going to be perfect. Also, to do with coffee freshness, hopefully you can have coffee that was roasted around 2 to 3 days ago, no earlier than that, but also you don't want anything that's roasted more than around 3 weeks ago. The beauty of the French press is the long steep time means that you can get everything out of the coffee that you possibly can, whereas other styles of filter brewing like pour over or siphon, while they're good in their own right, they all have a very short brew time, and it means that no matter what, some of the heavier molecules that are in the coffee particle won't extract, and you're missing out on some of the deeper and more interesting nuances in every coffee that you get. I'm ready to pour my French press. I'm going to do a final plunge. Before I do, you'll note that the coffee has all fallen away from the bottom of the filter. This means that I'll be able to plunge very easily. You shouldn't require more strength than you can provide with just 2 fingers. If you need any more force than that, you want to stop and then continue to plunge after the pressure is released. If you're using too much pressure to plunge, what's going to happen is you're going to over-extract the coffee because you're agitating the coffee grounds, the small particles that are still underneath the filter, more. You'll notice the last bits of gas coming out. I'm requiring almost no force at all to do this. Ready to pour. That's actually pretty good. One final thing before I go. A lot of the time I find when people make French press coffee, they won't pour all the coffee out all at once. If they're making this much coffee and it's just for themselves, for instance, they'll just pour the first cup and then wait to have the second cup later. You shouldn't do this. while the coffee is still in the chamber, even though the filter has been pushed down, it'll continue to extract with the coffee that's in the bottom here, meaning that if the coffee you've just poured is delicious, the next cup is going to be quite bitter and horrible. What you want to do if you're not going to pour all the coffee out at once is make sure you pour it into a separate vessel to decant from later on.